Thank you. And thank you all for coming back. I trust everyone had a good lunch. We're starting our second panel, non-military planning for DPRK collapse. We're also starting our drill, civil defense drill, so the fireworks outside will hopefully match the fireworks here on this panel. We wanted to have a session on non-military planning for various contingencies, in part based on the realization that the North Korea threat, especially the challenge of North Korea collapse, is more than a military challenge. One of the things that the United States learned following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or I should say relearned, following the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that military planning needs to account for more than military operations, that economics, civil governance, and environmental issues can have military and even strategic effects. And there's an urge not only for Korea, but more broadly throughout the Department of Defense and the US government to include non-military aspects of planning into our contingency planning and thinking about future challenges. So we wanted to bring some of that discussion here into today's discussion about the future of the US-ROK alliance. Now clearly we have very good military cooperation between the US and ROK militaries. Our planning is very robust and is under the Strategic Alliance 2015 rubric, looking ahead to the challenges that we'll be facing, to the military challenges that we'll be facing. We wanted to be able to use this panel to talk about some of the non-military issues that the alliance should address, and how we go forward from here. So today we have two speakers, a much smaller official lineup than the last panel. We have Patrick Cronin from my organization at CNAS, and Dr. Shin from KIDA. So what our game plan is to have 15-minute presentations followed by 5-minute comments by discussants, which should give us 5 to 10 minutes for questions from the audience. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Patrick Cronin from CNAS.
Abe, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Let me begin by expounding a point of view, and that point of view is based on my many years in government service as well as an analyst. And let me say that despite the enormous hard work and intentions of senior officials in what is an extraordinarily healthy US-ROK alliance, if there were a collapse in North Korea, we are woefully underprepared for that collapse. Now, let me just step back from that bold assertion. I thought we needed to do something to sort of start the post-lunch. I didn't want you to go to sleep right away. And I wasn't sure whether the drills would kick in just now to help me. There you go.
Right on cue.
Right on cue. Now, nobody can predict the future, least of all experts, and I mean that literally. If you're familiar with the work of Professor Philip Tetlock, he has empirically proven, testing 82,000 expert predictions, that these experts were wrong more than 50% of the time. That is, if you flipped a coin, you would be more often correct than an expert. That's a very embarrassing thing for a think tank personality to admit, because we like to think we can stay ahead of others and predict the future. I'm very familiar with so much of the discussions in the US-ROK alliance in the 1990s. Everything pointed in the direction of collapse in the early 1990s. First of all, there was still just the euphoria of winning the Cold War. The Soviet Union, this huge, monumentally but military power, but an anachronistic economy, seemed to be, in many ways, a mirror image of North Korea's sort of system. And North Korea now was losing its founding father, Kim Il-sung. It was facing dire economic ties, not least because the patronage of the two major powers of Russia and China were now on a cash basis. They weren't giving assistance, they were selling only. And the famine was an expression of the profound economic failure of North Korea. So it was not a surprise that our South Korean allies in the 90s told us time and again to expect the collapse of North Korea within the next 2 years. It was sort of like predictions we hear today about when Iran will have a nuclear weapon. It's always about 1 or 2 years in the future. And I think that story is important to remember right now because we have read recently how at least one very noted senior South Korean official, and a very smart man, has been quoted now in newspapers around the world as predicting that after the death of Kim Jong-il, North Korea may be 2 or 3 years away from collapse. And I think that's entirely possible. It may be a way, and it may be that just because we were wrong in the 90s doesn't mean it's wrong to assume that collapse could happen this time. After all, the economy really is truly broken. Kim Jong-un is not even Kim Jong-il, and the patronage of China could change. That is, that's one of those issues out for debate. How China defines its national interests, as Victor Cha said this morning, is hard for us to know for sure, but it could change its calculation of its interests in a way that might curtail a lot of the patronage that has kept afloat a broken North Korean government. So, while Nicholas Taleb is absolutely right about the scandal of prediction, we really don't have the luxury to forego focusing on a collapse scenario. That is, collapse must be part of the portfolio of contingency plans between the allies. And those contingency plans take us into not just kinetic areas, as my colleague Abe Denmark pointed out, but into a lot of non-kinetic issues. So my second set of comments really relate to the so-called comprehensive approach. This is somewhat like searching for the Holy Grail. Governments around the world, including the United States, have been looking for the mix of political, military, economic, and other factors that can help prosecute a strategy successfully, even in the midst of conflict. Tomorrow in Washington, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton will issue the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review Report. This is a brand new capabilities assessment of the State Department, our diplomats, and the United States Agency for International Development, our development experts. And this is now something that will happen, if she has her way, every 4 years, so that our civilian power, as she calls it in the report, can be as prepared as our military power. And indeed, the Pentagon has long pursued this kind of planning. Much of this approach on civilian power grew out of the wars of the last 10 years, especially for the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the civilian elements of our stability operational plans were lacking. And again, I can go back. I was in the George W. Bush administration, the number 3 official at USAID at the time, and I was sent over to the White House to plan the reconstruction of Iraq before the invasion. And we were told at the outset that USAID, the development experts, did not need to worry about conflict. The military would take care of that. We should assume peace. And we should assume peace and just get on with the business of building schools and hospitals. This is very dangerous to think that you can compartmentalize expertise and then expect those experts to come together and work seamlessly in a crisis. It doesn't work that way. So one of the reasons why you need whole-of-government approaches is to plan ahead of time so that you are less badly prepared than you would be otherwise. And I say that because, as Assistant Secretary of State Kirk Campbell has been saying for at least a decade, right now the U.S. and ROC have two choices between being badly prepared for what's happening in North Korea in the future or being really badly prepared. And so that's what preparation is all about. It's trying to minimize our risk and trying to maximize our ability to effectively act in concert so that we can minimize casualties, minimize costs, and hopefully best pursue whatever the strategy is, either in the short term, in terms of maybe reestablishing some semblance of peace, or whether it's the longer term objective that I think our two nations share, which is the peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula. But peaceful unification, one, it may not be peaceful, and two, it may still be a distant goal. So we have to think about those intermediate steps all along the way. Another issue on comprehensive approaches, I just want to again underscore how economics are often an afterthought by national security communities. And yet economic issues and financial issues, which I hardly have to tell people in Seoul, are at the heart of strategies for many people, for many countries. So it is vitally important that we attach and combine economics and security, whether it's in negotiations, so that we think about the incentives, future development incentives, for instance, that are held out and have been held out to North Korea for improving their behavior and for stopping violations, or whether it's a stick in resorting to more clever, more stringent financial sanctions and financial measures that could really make the regime in Pyongyang feel the pain for actions that they might contemplate, be it a third nuclear test or proliferation or another provocation like the shelling of Yeonpyeong, or for actions that they have taken. Anyway, so the third point is when planning for collapse or planning for any scenario, you do begin with your end state. You do begin with your objectives. And it's very important that the ROK and United States officials share common objectives. And I think this is probably the richest area of dialogue that has taken place in recent years between our two governments, and very successfully, very rich understanding on both sides, a good sense of objectives, good sense of North Korean possible actions. I think all of that has been very rich. But we still don't know, between the best analysts in our countries, whether North Korea will indeed be so weak that it actually collapses. And that's why, again, we don't have the luxury of saying it's not going to collapse, it's durable, didn't collapse in the 90s, let's not plan on it. If it happens, you know, we'll deal with it then. You can't do that because it's too irresponsible. Now, in planning for collapse, collapse may not at first appear to be collapse. When will we know whether it's a collapse? We certainly have to plan for, and we already do, for a range of humanitarian scenarios that involve refugees, involve economic pain and poverty, famine, and we're, I think, familiar with economic lifelines to North Korea. But this could happen on a scale that we have not seen. And being prepared to scale up, to enlarge the capacity of not just the ROK in the US, but the international community and how that would work, including with non-governmental organizations, because they have traditionally had a strong role to play. That this is a planning scenario that is part of a collapse scenario and must be undertaken, with the knowledge of military planners and other national security planners. I think second part of a collapse scenario is that you should not and cannot assume peace. You cannot assume that whatever assistance is being provided will be provided in a non-hostile, a permissive environment, as they would call it in the U.S. And therefore that uses of force would be part of the delivery even of economic assistance. And that's a very controversial issue, but it's not one that anybody seeks. It's just a matter of you may not have a choice because the enemy, as we say, has a vote on what happens. And if North Korea decides that they're still using force, even if they're collapsing, it's not for us to tell them that they're not supposed to do that, but we have to be ready for it. Another part of planning for collapse in North Korea, because it could involve acts of force, including attacks on South Korea, including even weapons of mass destruction, is that you have to be prepared for resilient societies. So literally the civil defense drill that is ongoing now is really a token down payment on the kind of thing that needs to prepare societies. And there was a comment made this morning, and I certainly fully shared the sentiment of the Korean who said, you know, we Koreans don't want to be like Israel. We don't want you to be like Israel either. But again, you do have a very nasty neighbor to the north who has a lot of capacity to inflict pain and who's playing potentially its own economic games with South Korea. Because of the wealth of South Korea, because of the open economy, you're highly vulnerable, whether to cyber attacks or to kinetic attacks. And so working with civil society and the private sector and communities, including communities where there are bases, all of that has to be part of the planning. And traditionally that was not part of planning. This is a new development. We didn't used to think about this. Planning was something that was done in the bowels of the Pentagon in the United States. The institute that I used to run was started 26 years ago because they realized that top secret defense planning needed the ideas on the outside, not just the ideas inside uniformed officers, as good as they were. So it's that eclectic approach toward planning that's very important. I think the regime upheaval, in terms of being prepared for a collapse scenario, is what is China's role, obviously. And China's never stopped playing a role ever since the just war that we have heard about this morning. And in fact, right now, China is using, to some considerable effect, its economic influence to burrow in to North Korea. So when we read in the newspapers, based on apparently authoritative cables, that the North Koreans are bribing and being bribed for gold and copper and mineral extractive industries inside North Korea, because it's one of the few things they have, minerals. And that is creating networks of and ties and bonds between China and North Korea, and economic futures potentially that are crowding out South Koreans' rightful influence over the rest of the Korean Peninsula. How that ties into the military calculations of China is a very important thing to think about, to talk about, and to plan. The role of allies as well, and there again, Evans Revere made a very apt statement that I would just again want to echo, that because of the bases for the United States based in Japan, Japan has a huge role to play in ensuring information, logistical support, cross-servicing agreements with the United States that are absolutely pivotal, and any kind of planning for collapse that didn't closely consult with Japan would be, again, a mistake, because they would have to be brought into something so dire as the collapse of North Korea in terms of planning, in terms of logistics, in terms of support. So those are some of my initial thoughts about planning. I do think that we actually need a range of planning strategies. Planning strategies for coercive diplomacy or pressure on North Korea as part of a bargaining. We need economics and development as part of a carrot for negotiations for future development of North Korea. We need them for just humanitarian assistance and disaster relief scenarios short of collapse. We need them, though, as well for the sudden collapse scenarios that could bring about a stabilization mission and could bring about ultimately unification, but not unification that South Korea just walks into, here are the keys to the kingdom, go take it over. but rather is in a very messy, contested, regional, uncertain type of conflict and contingency. So I think that it's important for us to advance our strategy through economic and developmental means, and I think it's important to be ready for the unpredictable by better utilizing this comprehensive approach, being ready to talk about collapse scenarios. So I know I haven't actually told you about how to plan for a collapse scenario, but I've at least thrown out some initial comments on my thinking on this very delicate issue. So Abe, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Denmark. I also thank to EAI and CNAS for having me at this important seminar. I also thank the 평택 City for supporting this seminar. My given subject is North Korea's non-military countermeasure in preparation of a sudden change in North Korea. Well, frankly speaking, I'm the one who believed that ROC and US and even China cannot do anything without military intervention during the sudden change in North Korea. We can only hit around the bush without military presence in the north. But anyway, I got to this subject and thought what ROC can do during the sudden change of North Korea. So I summarized my idea based on the timeline of military intervention, because even the content of non-military measures can be different based on the military presence in the north. We have probably over 100 of researches have conducted on the issue of North Korea's sudden change. And it is a very popular issue since the middle of the 1990s. So I think I also participated over 10 times on related project. And then former studies can be summarized issues like this. But the first one is the concept. There are too many different views on the concept of a sudden change. So here also we need to define the concept, and here I suggest the collapse of a regime or state in short period of time. Second is the preparing for sudden change must work for the limitation of humanitarian disaster, but some want more, like a unification. And then so we have to discuss about that. Third, the cooperation between the ROC and US is necessary. This is a fundamental principle when you're preparing sudden change. Based upon this, I'm going to explain my view. And by the way, this is 100% my personal view and do not reflect any of the organization and those of Qaeda. First, the subject is the possibility of North Korea's sudden change. Indeed, many scholars and governmental officials have different views. On the one hand, there are inherent problems of North Korea's regime: isolation and worst economic situation, and the 27-year-old crown prince with ill dictators. These are the sources of weakness. I heard some interesting rumor yesterday that which is that Kim Jong-un is in fact not the son of Kim Jong-il. No, he's the son of Kim Il-sung of age 72. That's just a rumor. It's a joke. Yeah, that's the reason why Kim Jong-il so looks like his grandfather, and is raised by Kim Kyung-hee, Kim Il-sung's daughter. No, this kind of rumors reflects the weakness of North Korea, I think. But on the other hand, there are many factors, stabilizing factors, in particular to North Korea. The first one, most important one, is the people of North Korea. People obeying with no experience of democracy. I think this is the most strong point for Kim Jong-il's regime, and also Kim Jong-il's regime do the successful political propaganda and the nuclear weapon as a deterrent or negotiation chip, because if a Kim Jong-il regime face a serious problem, they can use nuclear weapon as bargaining chip for survival of each regime. So I think there is a contending view, but currently at this stage there is a low probability of a sudden change in North Korea. but it depends highly on the time of Kim Jong-il's death. So the longer he lives, the less a sudden change occurs. As I mentioned, there is a limitation of non-military measures because there are many areas in need of military support. For example, prevention or settlement of armed conflict inside North Korea, or providing security for humanitarian disaster, humanitarian support, securing border regions to prevention of North Korean defectors. In addition, military concerns should be solved prior to related issues, and the fundamental change in North Korea will be solved through military measures. However, even military operation cannot solve all problems, so it is worth to look into non-military measures. As Dr. Cronin already mentioned about the scenarios, as you know, there are hundreds of scenarios can be possible, but these are some types, and some of them are step-by-step scenario, and the others are abrupt change. But in any way, the decision-making factors are almost same. So we have to consider participants and security and humanitarian support and resources. These are the key issues we have to examine. Now we are going to look into the non-military measure before military intervention. This is probably early stage of sudden change or less serious situation. So damage from the sudden change is relatively light, but the economic pressure is expected to be high because there will be many requests for humanitarian support. In addition, as time goes by, we face ethical issues, whether we support Kim Jong-il regime to minimize human disaster, or we have to wait until it totally collapses. It can be ethical issues. Lastly, we have to consider the amount of resources. There's a limited resource in Republic of Korea, so we need more resources from United States and international support. The next thing we can consider is a strategic structure in Northeast Asia. Before the military intervention, strategic structure might be relatively simple. There are unlimited participants, and the issue can be solved based on common interest of international community in the need of prevention of a humanitarian disaster, and participation from all interested parties is encouraged. In relation to strategic structure in Northeast Asia, there will be no visible sign of a change in existing strategic structure despite of great confusion, because China will continue to try and maintain its influence in North Korea, and RA and United States will strive for the more stabilized Korean Peninsula, and neighboring nations and international community will work to settle North Korea's problem. The next issue is security. It seems difficult to secure safe humanitarian support without military intervention. There will be many difficulties in conducting active humanitarian support. Thus, a diplomatic discussion on military intervention will be in progress, and interested nations will discuss the type of intervention: ROC US-led intervention, or including neighboring states, or UNPKO, or intervention by multilateral forces, and etc. On the other hand, many nations will pay attention to the safety measures on nuclear facilities. There is a possibility of outflow of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials, and we don't have a means to control nuclear weapons or materials in North Korea without military intervention. Thus, tight control of transporting goods in the border area might be only option for South Korea and United States. And most important non-military measure before military intervention is humanitarian support. we have to save people during the sudden change. So we need to food aid to prevent a victim of starvation. In addition, supporting medical care and sanitation is necessary because there is a possibility of epidemics. So we need to provide medicine and sanitations. Probably most challenging issue at this stage is to prevent North Korea's defectors and the construction of refugee camps. There will be huge migration attempts to obtain food and freedom. Some say hundreds of thousands might, or some say even millions defectors might occur during the sudden change. The number of defectors will increase if food aid is not provided in time because they need survival. So they try to move outside of North Korea. So to China, to Russia, even to Japan and South Korea, there is a possibility of a refugee inflow. And then in particular, regarding South Korea, it is a very we have a high probability of a refugee inflow due to geographical, legal, and political reasons because we provide citizenship to North Korean without any condition. So we also have to construct refugee camps in the South Korea, neighboring nations, and third countries such as Mongolia, if possible. And the questions of recognizing North Korean defectors as refugees is also a big issue because China do not recognize North Korean defectors as refugees. So we have a close cooperation with the neighboring nations and UNHCR. Lastly, we have to obtain proper resources. Republic of Korea has use of resources, which is Inter-Korean Cooperation Fund, which amount of billions of US dollars, but it's not enough. So we need international support, and we are expecting the support from neighboring nations and UN and other international organizations. If North Korea's situation becomes worse, neighboring countries start to think about military intervention. Since we cannot discuss the topic here, the next issue is non-military measures after military intervention. Here we have too many options to consider. First, seriousness of the situation and preventing it from spreading. Probably, North Korea's situation is worse than before when you consider the non-military measure before military intervention. Second is the settlement of Kim Jong-il regime here. It might be differ by the aspect of participation parties. China's intervention will be key factor because China may want another pro-China government in the north. So it will result either in setting up an independent government in North Korea or unified Korea. On the other hand, diplomatic domestic politics of Republic of Korea and the United States will also play a critical role. As time goes by, there will be huge domestic debates about its expenditures and obtaining sustainable support. So it might be a political issues. After the military intervention, there will be huge change based upon participation. The parties of military interventions are the actual participants in North Korea's sudden change. So intervening nations will be the key players. But even among participants, the division of labor is necessary. Who will lead? Who will be supported? Who will support? Will be the key issue and hotly debated during the circumstances. In addition, those intervening nations will lead the strategic structure in Northeast Asia. Again, China's intervention will be key factors, and there is a possibility of a physical confrontation in the process of intervention. Neighboring nations will hope their influence over the stable North Korea. So we need the intensive discussion at the time. After the military intervention, security in North Korea will be improved. So it will be possible to conduct active humanitarian support. In addition, we need to disarm, demobilize, and rehabilitate former North Korean military personnel. Probably, ROC and United States, in particular United States, is very active in securing nuclear weapons. Securing nuclear weapons and other facilities and materials and scientists, technicians, and even blueprints. So also we have to start the process of denuclearization, and we also need the support from police forces to maintain public security. After military intervention, humanitarian support such as food, medical, and sanitation assistance will be easier. But there would be more concern about increasing economic burden on participating nations because we have to afford those kind of expense comes from military intervention. In addition, problems of North Korea defectors will remain at this stage. So number of defectors expected to decrease and active humanitarian support taking place within North Korea, returning North Korean defectors from neighboring nations, and constructing refugee camps within North Korea will be hot issue in this stage. In relation to resources, high cost expected from military intervention, so there would be high demand for economic support in and outside Korean Peninsula. I expected, as I already mentioned, about international support. In particular, at this stage, we can expect Japanese compensation for colonial rule. It might over the billions of dollars, so North Korea can use the money to feed its people and boost its economy. But it is highly probable that we face a shortage of resources or great burden of economic support. We must recognize this kind of economic burden during the sudden change of North Korea. We cannot just thinking about the fantasy. North Korea's sudden change cast a lot of implication to ROC-US alliance. So we have to maintain cooperation principle, and we have to maintain common objectives. But I believe ROC and US already agree upon suggested objective, so we do not have a problem in this field. In addition, I'd like to emphasize the crisis management in early stage. As I mentioned, the faster the food aid come to the North Korea, there will be lesser defectors occur. So early warning is very critical to minimize the effect, and securing prompt cooperation from neighboring nations and assessing participation is also very important. And sharing responsibility between ROC and US is very critical. We had agreed that Korea take leading role and United States supporting role principle should be maintained, but we have to consider, can South Korea deal with China and Russia without the help of United States? Can South Korea induce participation or support from international community? We must have found answer on these questions. So I personally believe that active role of United States is necessary. strategic dealing with the neighboring nations, and securing support from international community, and leading prompt to securing of nuclear weapons and material, building a domestic country in the Korean Peninsula through the support for unified Korea. That is the expectation I have to the United States. U.S. must deal with China, so without or without military intervention. Now, as noticed, China regards North Korea as strategic balance weight against the United States these days. China seems like a feeling that rivalry against the United States, so it seems the balance in Northeast Asia by supporting North Korea, who is in hostile relations with the United States. So we have to expect China's behavior, probably economic aid, security and safety, or stability in border areas, support to pro-China factions, and for procuring WMDs before the United States and denying United States intervention, building pro-China government and interfering with unification. That's probably China's affection on the sudden change. I think we have also considered the policy. That's the reason we have to consider the policy direction towards China in sudden change. Yeah, I have a limited time, so I'm just going to skip through. Yeah, I saw your hand. Yeah. It is realistically possible to exclude China. The question is, it is realistically possible to exclude China? That's the first question I have. No, yes, maybe possible, but we have the means of persuasion. But I think we have to lead China in a positive way instead of excluding China. And then but clearly block out China's negative role. And this is my hope. We probably all Koreans we need unification if North Korea's sudden change occurs. But we have to solve differences among neighboring countries. So, for example, the 2+4 treaty in case of German unification might be a good example. Sorry, here is my conclusion. The possibility of a sudden change in North Korea in current stage is very low. But under the current structure, sudden change is inevitable in the long run. So through participation, thorough preparation is required, as I emphasized. ROC and US preparations are progressing smoothly, but more attention is needed in the non-military field. To prevent humanitarian tragedy, developments are expected in politics, diplomatic, economic, and information sectors. Thank you.